third bullet point down, I think this is good news because, again, people get a little frustrated thinking, well, everything's changed and you can't fund your project or you can't fund your company. I think you absolutely can. Business plan or your divisional business plan or your concept plan and your team, both internal and external, and execution and timing can still determine success. So if you can demonstrate that you have a grasp on those things, that leads to funding. Funding and execution lead to success. Great companies still fund capital if they plan and execute. So what do we need to know? As I mentioned a couple times, package financing is from multiple sources, multiple layers, is now kind of the norm. So if you can qualify for some grant funding or some forgivable loan funding, or at the federal level, at the state level, if you can qualify for some industry assistance, you need to be aware of all of those things because that way you can pick and choose if you've got the luxury of doing that. But you can't just wait around for one funding source. One of the things that I've seen in the last 3 years for sure is companies that look for this free money out there and they try to either take a business plan that really wasn't particularly solid and go into an area because they thought there was free money, or they structured their business or their execution based on the promise of free money. And maybe they got the money and maybe they didn't, but the money that you can tap or access as straight incentives, grants, is usually fairly limited. Usually comes with strings attached to it. It takes some time to get it, and it can affect your execution. It can certainly affect your execution during the timing period when you should be running full speed, and it can affect the direction you run. And so it's very important for companies to be cautious about that. Don't get bogged down on the free money thing. As I talked about a little bit, monetary and non-monetary. So training, education, in-kind testing, research, internships, all of those things. Some of those are through industry groups. Some of them are just through connections. If you talk to others, again, in the state of Iowa, you'll hear me hit that theme a lot. But you can't build teams around here that can actually bring business to you. And so that has tremendous value. Public-private, we kind of talked about that. That's really getting to be a little bit of a buzzword. Obviously, I'm a big believer in public-private. It's a little bit like green and renewable and sustainable. Everybody wants to put that label on their project, but let's think about what it means. In my mind, there are formal and informal public and private partnerships and relationships, and they can all be of value. Even simply knowing the folks at, say, IDED, or at the USDA, or the DNR, it just depends on what industry you're in, but knowing them on a relationship basis and a level of trust, and knowing them before you have an ask can be really, really valuable to you. Now, granted, the people that are in, say, the demonstration fund, or the enterprise zone fund, or things like that at the Department of Economic Development, they're used to people having an ask. That's understandable. But building that relationship with them before that, or even the industry leaders that are on the board, has tremendous value. Universities and community colleges are good sources of training, good sources of research, good sources of interns or employees who can help you out. We do a lot of work with companies up at Iowa State, coming out of Iowa State's research park. There's a lot of synergy up there. Industry and strategic partners, we kind of talked about that. You can get a lot of help through industry and strategic partners through trade associations. We're building relationships that build business, and people don't traditionally think of those as funding sources or funding alternatives, but they absolutely can be. And then, of course, I've just named all the levels of government: federal, state, county, local. All those types of incentives are out there. What you want to do, in my mind, as you're doing your business plan, figure out your need, your capital need. What do you need to execute? What's your timeline? And then explore all of these possible sources of funding, and then pick and choose if you can. Debt financing, obviously, you want to take a look at that. And then you can have both bank and non-bank. Strategic versus financial, I think I've talked about that a little bit, but I think it's really, really important. On your relationships, on the business side, building out your channel partners, on funding sources, on equity investors. If you've ever been associated with a company that brought in the wrong partner, the wrong investor, and usually that's a big investor, but I have a good client that had succeeded very well in the tech area. This was before they were a client of mine I need to mention. They took money on a deal from a VC from the East Coast, and there's lots of great VCs from the East Coast. They struck a bad deal in the contracts. More importantly, they made a bad choice in their investment partner, and they have essentially lost their company. Now, when you take VC dollars, oftentimes you will take dilution, you will lose some level of control, but if you pick the right company, and if you talk to a company that's funded their growth through the right strategic investor, it's fabulous. I mean, it's great. It's strategic, they're helpful, they're involved in management in a good way. These guys, on the other hand, chose the wrong one and essentially ruined their company from their perspective. Friends, family, pools, angels, local seed funds, all those different sources, you need to look at those. And as I'll mention in a little bit, in light of the stage you're at and what you need and what you're trying to build. Free money, we talked about this a little bit already. It's limited, comes with strings and delays. Again, my advice, be aware of it. Don't miss an opportunity for free money. Obviously, that's great. But don't start with it as the basis of your business plan. I've seen that too often. Team and the business plan come first, and then you can check on the assistance. And be prepared to focus on and satisfy the program requirements. When I talk about building your external team, if you've got an external team that's used to working with the funding source that you're talking about, whether it's a private investor or an investor group or an angel group or a VC, it doesn't matter. If you've got somebody who either is used to working with people in that area, or even better yet, if they've got a relationship or used to working with that group, that's wonderful. Take advantage of their experience. I've helped a couple of companies get funding through the Iowa Power Fund, which is, as we know, is about finished. But it's very interesting to see the level of, it's not even the quality of the submissions, it's sort of the aim of the submission. So you'd see somebody, they tell you what they were going to do, you think that's a good fit for Power Fund money, and then you'd see what they submitted. I had a client that the submission that they were going to, I was just asked to give it a blessing. Well, one of the first things that they emphasized was their partnering arrangement and their research with a company that was going to get some of the funds located in Colorado. The Iowa Power Fund does not have a whole lot of interest in focusing on stimulating economic development in Colorado. While they could work with that company, that was fine. They needed to just sort of, tweak that a little bit in terms of how they emphasize it and how they submit it. Small print, all right. Let's see. So we're talking about, these are just some of the sources of information, advice, connections, and they deliver value. Sometimes they deliver cash. We've talked, I know I've got to beat this theme, but these financing alternatives. And I can't emphasize enough, is Iowa, it's easy to connect. It is easy to connect with people who know people who can help you in your business. So I just named a few of them. ABI, obviously, had to be on top. IDET, Venture Net Farm Bureau, you can read all the rest. All of those sources, even down to the investment bankers and the VCs and private equity, can be sources of information and advice to you, even if you're not going to get funding from them. What you don't want to do is go to the wrong source for the wrong thing and ask them for something that they're never a good fit for you anyway, because I think the flip side of Iowa being an easy state to connect in is it's an easy state to disconnect in. So if you are the one that this entrepreneurial community or the ADI, the business community, if you're the one that they're talking about who has a terrible business plan, or if you're the one who went to the wrong group asking for the wrong thing, that gets out there too, and it's hard to recover from that. So careful planning leads to execution. These are some pretty basic themes, I think, but I think they're helpful when you're thinking about funding and capitalization. What's your goal? It obviously affects your business plan and your strategies. All of these can be great goals. A mom and pop company that's profitable and that supports the family, that's wonderful. A lifestyle company is maybe just a little bit more than that. Want to grow a little bit more. Want to be maybe the most successful person in a small town in Iowa. That's wonderful. A growth company or entrepreneurial growth and exit. All of those things. Probably, the group at ADI at this conference probably has included people at all those levels. And so, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, if you're trying to be one of those first two, we don't need to talk about VC funding. They're not really into that. If you want to be the third, maybe we do. Maybe we need to be. Maybe you're at a stage where we need to be talking about private equity. Maybe we're not. It all depends on what stage you're at and what your goals are. Business plan. It's amazing to me how many companies, both mature companies and early stage companies, I meet with that don't have a well fleshed out business plan. And I don't necessarily even mean the paper document. Although, if you're like me, you need to have the paper document. Very paper dependent, as anybody worse than me can say. But the paper document, it holds you accountable by having to prepare it and having to revisit it and holding yourself accountable on that. What I mean when I say your business plan isn't just, it's not the paper, it's what's on the paper. It's not what's on the paper if it's in your head. If it's in your head, that's fine. But when I meet with early stage companies or growth stage companies, it doesn't matter. And I say, what's your strategy for sales? What's your strategy for marketing? What's your strategy for funding? And they don't have, it doesn't have to be a canned rehearsed answer, but they have to have an answer. If they don't, then you don't want to go to your bank, for example, and ask for a loan if you don't have that. And you, at a minimum, you want to have that executive summary at a minimum. Look at that, like I said, I already got that in the next level. Measure twice and cut once, that's the old adage of people that are, woodworkers primarily, which is really important for me because I'm really bad at wood. So that's a critical one, but I think it's appropriate for businesses as well. Think it through carefully, then execute. You do need to move quickly if you're an early stage company. Execution and moving on a fast track is really important. But it's really important to move on the right track. Remember, I had that bullet point said mistakes can be fatal. Think long term. Decisions today affect you tomorrow. That's really true in organizing your company and in capitalizing your company. A lot of times we'll work with folks who are looking to go out and raise equity dollars, or even go get debt financing, and they've done some wacky things at the early stages. Particularly on the equity side. If they don't have a clean capitalization table, they don't know who their owners are and what they own. If you're bringing in private equity or VC money or even angel investor or seed fund money, you want that information to be accurate and complete, and you also want it to show that you made good decisions. A lot of times you'll see these early stage companies that, the example I use is that they gave some equity to the paper bill. And there was no reason for it. It wasn't really involved in the company. It was the neighbor's kid, so he's got, 2%. And those things come back to haunt you. Also using equity as a cash substitute, which is a very viable strategy for early stage and growth stage companies to attract the best people, which is really what you want. But make good decisions with that because it's very expensive in terms of dilution later. The last one is really critical, and you would think that everybody would always have a focus on this, but they don't. And that's know your specific funding need, know your sources and uses. When people say, I need around $100,000 to $500,000, okay, you don't know what you need, and you immediately undermine your credibility. I had a meeting with someone just last week. It wasn't 100 to 500, but it was 100 to 300. And I said, okay, what are you going to do with that? Well, operations. Well, that's not good enough. A lender will not want to hear that. And if we bring it in as equity, it'll take a lot less dilution if you bring in $100,000 and that's what you need than if you bring in $300,000 and you needed $100,000. People and motivation are critical. This, again, is something that the speaker this morning said that I think is really, really important. And then, as I mentioned to you, that the VCs and the VC Association are in agreement that either market opportunity or your management team, one of those is the most important. The other one is the second most important, and your technology product is third most important. Most early stage companies wouldn't think that. And in fact, some later stage might not, but I would say the ones that are most savvy have learned that lesson over years of operations, that your team is really, really critical. So you want to assemble your team as early as you can, understanding that companies have cash constraints and can't always have everything perfect. That's one of the things that the lawyers need to understand, both in the structure and protection of your intellectual property and everything, and non-competes, all that stuff we understand comes with a cost, and so you can't do everything, but do what you can. When I think of the qualities you need on your team, both to run your business, but also to release capital, to execute your business plan, talent, experience. I think experience is a critical factor, and so that doesn't mean somebody has been in the industry for 20 years. That means they know this industry, they know some of the people in this industry, they know the players. Motivation. We talked about equity, incentivizing people, so stock option plans, things like that. Don't do those hastily, but if you're early stage or if you're growth stage or if you've got a new product that you want to really motivate, bring in the right people, equity incentive compensation would be a very good idea.